My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I stood in the church parking lot trying to zip up my dress. It was my brother's rehearsal dinner, and I had exactly 4 minutes before my husband would come looking for me. I pressed my palms flat against the car door and breathed slowly. I told myself I could do this. I had done harder things. I had done things that would make most people in that ballroom faint before their appetizers arrived. My name is Claire Merritt, and my husband is a welder. I know how that sounds to certain people. I know the exact expression that crosses their face, that quick flicker of something between pity and amusement, that involuntary recalibration of who you are and what your life must look like. I've watched it happen 100 times over the past 8 years. I stopped being surprised by it somewhere around year 3. What I never stopped being surprised by was how often the person making that face was my own sister-in-law. Her name is Diane. She married my brother Kevin 4 years ago, and from the very first Thanksgiving where she sat across the table from my husband Daniel and asked with genuine curiosity in her voice whether welding was like a union thing or more of a temp situation, I understood exactly who she was. She wasn't cruel in the way that announces itself. She was cruel in the way that wears pearls and asks follow-up questions. She'd tilt her head and say things like, "Oh, that's so interesting. I just never knew people still did that by hand," as if Daniel were a blacksmith she discovered at a Renaissance fair. Daniel never seemed to mind. That was one of the first things I loved about him. The way other people's opinions passed through him like light through glass, leaving no mark. He'd smile, answer her questions genuinely, and then go back to his food. He had big hands, always slightly rough, no matter how well he scrubbed them, and he used them like instruments. He could weld a structural joint that would outlast every person in that room, and he knew it, and that was enough for him. It was never enough for Diane. I met Daniel when I was 23. I'd just finished my business degree and taken an entry-level job at a logistics company in Columbus. He was doing contract work at the same industrial park, and I saw him eating lunch alone on a concrete barrier outside, actually reading, a beat-up paperback copy of Lonesome Dove. And something about that stopped me. We talked for 40 minutes that first day. He was funny and direct and didn't perform anything. He asked real questions and listened to the answers. By the 3rd week, I was bringing 2 lunches. My family liked him well enough at first. My mother thought he was polite. My father shook his hand and nodded in that way fathers do when they're reserving judgment, but not issuing a warning. Kevin, who was finishing law school at the time, was pleasant but distant. It was only after Daniel and I got serious, after I turned down a relocation offer from my company to stay in Columbus, that the temperature started to shift. Diane entered the picture shortly after. She and Kevin got engaged 18 months into dating. A courthouse ceremony followed by a lavish party at her parents' country club in Westerville. I remember standing near the bar that night and watching her scan the room with the efficient eyes of someone cataloging assets. When her gaze landed on Daniel, who was in a perfectly nice blazer talking to my uncle about the Columbus Blue Jackets, something in her expression settled into a permanent category. She'd made up her mind about him, and about me by extension, before we'd exchanged 20 words. The comment started small. How did we like our apartment? Was it cozy? Had we thought about buying, or was that still a ways off? When Daniel started his own welding business at 31, taking on commercial contracts, hiring 2 employees, building something real, Diane found a new angle. "Oh, you're like a small business owner now," she'd say, with the word small doing a lot of heavy lifting. When we bought our first house, a 4-bedroom in a good school district, that we paid cash for because Daniel had been quietly saving since he was 19, she toured it with the expression of someone being polite about a gift they don't want. But the worst of it happened at my niece's birthday party 2 years ago. We were all standing around the backyard. Kevin and Diane had just put in a new pool, and Diane was talking to her friend Melissa about renovations. I was half listening, refilling my drink, when I heard her say, "We'd never really considered that neighborhood. It just feels like the kind of place people end up rather than choose." She wasn't looking at me when she said it. She didn't have to. I went home that night and sat at the kitchen table while Daniel was in the shower, and I did something I almost never did. I cried. Not because I believed her. I'd stopped caring what Diane thought of our neighborhood years ago. I cried because I was tired. 8 years of small comments and tilted heads and loaded pauses. 8 years of watching my husband be quietly diminished by someone who had never once in her life made something with her hands. 8 years of smiling through it because Kevin was my brother and I didn't want to make things hard for him, and because Daniel always said it wasn't worth the fight, and because I genuinely believed that the life we'd built was its own answer to everything she'd ever implied. I just hadn't expected to have to deliver that answer in public. Kevin's rehearsal dinner, his second wedding after his first marriage, didn't survive the third year, was being held at a restaurant downtown that Diane had recommended. She and Kevin had been together for 2 years at that point, and I could see my brother was happy in the uncomplicated way that he hadn't been in a long time, and that mattered to me more than anything else. I'd made peace with Diane, or something close enough to peace that I could maintain it over a 3-course meal. I'd ironed my dress. I'd reminded myself that the evening wasn't about me. What I had not accounted for was the open microphone portion of the evening. There was a moment midway through dinner when Kevin's best man stood up and said that anyone who wanted to share a memory or a toast was welcome to take the floor. It was loose and warm and people were a few drinks in. Kevin's college roommate told a story about a camping trip. My mother talked about the first time Kevin brought a girl home. A few of Diane's friends said predictably beautiful things about her. And then Diane's mother, a thin woman from Dayton named Patricia who wore her opinions like jewelry, stood up and looked directly at our table. She talked about her daughter's journey. She talked about how Diane had always known her worth and never settled. She talked about the importance of marrying someone who matches your ambitions, who understands what it means to build a real future. She was smiling the whole time. Her voice never rose. And then she said, looking briefly but unmistakably in my direction, "Some people learn early that love alone doesn't pay the bills. The smart ones make sure their partner has a plan." The table went quiet. Not the whole restaurant, just our table, and the two next to it in that specific radius where people heard and understood and were deciding what to do with what they'd just heard. Kevin had gone slightly still. Daniel's hand, which had been resting near mine, didn't move. I felt something shift in my chest. Not anger. Not exactly. It was more like a door opening that I had been holding shut for a very long time. I didn't stand up. I didn't make a scene. I reached into my bag, which was on the chair beside me, and I took out my phone. I pulled up the file I'd saved there 3 weeks earlier, when our accountant had sent over our finalized documents. I turned the screen toward Daniel. He looked at it, then at me, and a slow smile crossed his face. The same smile he'd given me the day we closed on our house, and the day he hired his third employee, and the day I told him I was pregnant with our daughter. A smile that didn't need an audience. But Patricia was still standing, and she was looking at us, and Kevin was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, and so I stood up. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It wasn't triumph, not yet. It was something quieter and more durable than that. It was 8 years of Sunday mornings watching Daniel drive out before dawn to meet a crew. 8 years of watching him come home with burn marks on his forearms and still find the energy to cook dinner when I'd had a hard week. 8 years of watching him build something out of nothing, methodically and without complaint, because that was simply who he was. I stood up for all of that. I said, "I think you're right that a plan matters. Daniel and I are actually really grateful for his." Patricia smiled the way people smile when they think they're about to hear someone prove their point for them. She said, "Of course." I said, "His welding business cleared $412,000 last year. Net. We own our home and a commercial property outright. We have no debt." I paused. "But I hear what you're saying about plans." I sat down. The silence lasted about 4 seconds. Then Kevin's college roommate laughed. Not meanly, just the surprised laugh of someone who watched a play go completely differently than expected. And the room shifted back into movement and noise, and someone flagged down a server. Patricia sat down. Diane was looking at the centerpiece. Daniel put his hand over mine under the table, and pressed it once, gently, the way he did when he was telling me something without words. What I hadn't expected was what came after. Kevin found me near the exit an hour later, when the dinner was winding down and people were collecting coats and making promises to see each other soon. He looked older than I thought of him as looking, which is something that always happens when I see him in real light, away from family gatherings. He said, "You didn't have to do that." I said, "No, I didn't." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She's been doing that for a while, hasn't she?" It wasn't really a question. I said, "I love you, Kevin. I want you to be happy. I think you can be happy with her, but I need you to see it." He nodded slowly, the way he'd nodded as a kid when he was absorbing something he didn't want to absorb. He said he'd talk to her. I don't know what that conversation looked like. I wasn't there for it, but something changed after that night. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the incremental way that real things change. The comments stopped. Diane was different at Christmas. Not warm exactly, but quiet in a way that felt like an adjustment rather than a cold shoulder. She asked Daniel a real question about his work, a specific question, about a project, and listened to the answer without filing it away under a category. I'm not telling this story because I think what I did was perfect. Standing up at a rehearsal dinner and announcing your net income is not, by any measure, a graceful move. If I had a different personality, or more patience, or less accumulated wariness, I would have found another way. But I had 8 years of another way, and sometimes the thing that looks like dignity from the outside is actually just exhaustion wearing a nice dress. I'm telling this story because of what happened on the drive home that night. We were on the highway, our daughter asleep in her car seat in the back. The city lights sliding past the windows. Daniel had been quiet most of the evening. The comfortable kind of quiet he carries like a second language. And then he said, out of nowhere, "You know what I keep thinking about?" I said, "What?" He said, "When I was 20 and my shop teacher told me I had a gift, but I should still get a degree as a backup. Like my hands were a plan B." I looked at him. He said, "I'm glad I didn't listen." I thought about Patricia's voice, smooth and certain. I thought about Diane's expression the first time she toured our house. I thought about every small moment where someone had looked at my husband and seen a limitation instead of a choice. And I thought about the first time I saw him, eating lunch on a concrete barrier with a battered paperback, unbothered and completely himself, in a world that kept trying to tell him he should be something else. I reached over and put my hand on his arm. He had calluses from decades of work. His hands were never fully clean. He had built things that would stand long after everyone in that restaurant had forgotten the night entirely. I said, "Neither am I." We drove the rest of the way home in the kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled. The kind that only exists when two people have built something solid enough to rest in. Our daughter made a small sound in her sleep. The highway curved south toward our neighborhood, the one Diane had once described as the kind of place people end up rather than choose. We chose it. We chose it every day. And that, more than any number on any document, is what I most wanted Patricia to understand. Not that we had won by her metrics, but that we had never been playing her game. That there is a kind of life that doesn't announce itself at dinner parties. That doesn't require anyone else's assessment to be real. That a man who wakes before sunrise to make something with his hands is not a backup plan. He is the plan. He always was. Kevin called me 3 days later. We talked for an hour, the longest we'd talked in years. He told me some things about the first marriage that I hadn't known, and I told him some things about the past 8 years that I'd kept to myself. And by the end, we were both quiet in the way that means something has been repaired rather than covered over. He said, "I'm sorry I didn't see it." I said, "You see it now. He's getting married next Saturday. I have a new dress. Daniel has a clean blazer in his good hands and that same paperback on the nightstand, half finished, the same way he's been reading it for 20 years, because he only picks it up when things are still and good. Our daughter is going to be a junior bridesmaid, a fact she has discussed at length with anyone who will listen. I'm going to stand next to my brother and mean every word of the toast I give him. I'm going to look at Diane and feel, genuinely, that I hope she makes him happy, because that's what I want. That's all I've ever wanted. For the people I love to stop making smallness a virtue, to stop measuring lives in the currency of appearance, to understand that the most valuable things rarely photograph well. And if Patricia is there, with her careful eyes and her smooth voice, I'll smile at her. I will mean it. I have nothing left to prove to her, and I realized somewhere on that highway, in the dark, with my husband's arm warm under my hand, that I never did. Some people build their lives out of what other people think of them. Daniel built ours out of steel. I know which one will last.